The year was 80 AD, and the deafening roar of 50,000 spectators echoed through the stands of the newly inaugurated Colosseum. In the center of the arena, a young Christian woman named Perpetua was being tied to a stake as the gates slowly opened to reveal a starving lioness that had not eaten for 3 days. But this would not be just another Christian martyrdom. What was about to happen would surpass all limits of cruelty, even by Roman standards. The Emperor Titus had promised spectacles that would surpass anything Rome had ever seen. For 100 consecutive days, the arena would become the stage for the most inventive and horrendous forms of entertainment the human mind could conceive. These were not just executions. They were theaters of calculated sadism, where death became art and suffering, amusement. Today, we reveal the 5 most brutal arena spectacles of ancient Rome. Practices so extreme that even a civilization accustomed to violence occasionally recoiled from its own destructive creativity. These were not fights between professional gladiators, but macabre stagings specifically designed to satisfy the bloodlust of the masses. What kind of society would not only tolerate, but celebrate such atrocities? 5. Naumachia, naval battles in the arena. The Naumachiae were large-scale naval battles staged in flooded arenas or artificial lakes. The first documented Naumachia was organized by Julius Caesar in 46 BC to celebrate his military triumphs. For this, he had a basin dug near the Tiber River, large enough to hold real biremes, triremes, and quadriremes, warships of the Roman fleet. 2 fleets, composed of thousands of prisoners of war and condemned criminals, were forced to fight to the death. The objective was not just to simulate a battle, but to achieve maximum realism, which meant that casualties were extremely high. The spectators, comfortably seated in the stands, watched a real naval battle, with all the associated violence and chaos. The historian Suetonius describes how Caesar's Naumachia involved 4,000 rowers and 2,000 marines. The level of organization and resources required for such an event was colossal, demonstrating the power and wealth of the Roman state. The water was often dyed red to hide the blood, creating a visually impressive and terrifying spectacle. These events were not just entertainment, they were demonstrations of power. By recreating naval battles, Rome not only celebrated its military victories but also reminded its citizens and enemies of its absolute domain over the seas. 4. Damnatio ad bestias. Condemnation to the beasts. Damnatio ad bestias was a form of capital punishment in which the condemned were thrown to wild animals in the arena. This practice was particularly popular from the 1st to the 3rd century AD and was often reserved for the worst criminals, prisoners of war, and Christians. The animals, including lions, tigers, bears, and leopards, were starved for days to ensure maximum ferocity. The executions were often staged as mythological reenactments. For example, a condemned person could be tied to a stake, representing Prometheus, while an eagle, or a trained vulture, devoured his liver. In other cases, they were forced to play the role of mythological characters killed by beasts, such as Orpheus being devoured by bears. The spectacle was designed to be as humiliating and painful as possible. The condemned were often naked and defenseless, while the crowd cheered at the sight of their dismemberment. The philosopher Seneca, although a Stoic accustomed to the idea of death, described his disgust after witnessing such a spectacle. In the morning, men are thrown to lions and bears. At noon, they are thrown to the spectators themselves. They demand that the killer be thrown to another killer and reserve the victor for another slaughter. The end result for the combatants is death. The whole business is done with fire and steel. This happens while the arena is empty. 3. Ad gladium. Forced to fight. Ad gladium was another form of execution where the condemned with no military training were given a sword, gladius, and forced to fight against a fully armed and experienced gladiator. The outcome was almost always predictable. This was not a fair fight, but a slow and humiliating execution. The condemned, known as noxi, were seen as disposable beings whose lives had no value. Sometimes, 2 noxi were forced to fight each other until one died. The survivor was then either executed by a soldier or reserved for another fight. This practice highlighted the Roman obsession with martial skill. Even in an execution, the demonstration of fighting technique was valued. The professional gladiator, with his elegant and efficient movements, contrasted with the desperate clumsiness of the condemned, reinforcing the Roman ideal of virtus, courage, manliness, excellence. For the spectators, it was a demonstration of the superiority of the trained Roman warrior over the undisciplined barbarian or criminal. 2. The tunic of molestia, the human torch. The tunica molesta was a particularly cruel method of execution, often associated with the persecution of Christians under Emperor Nero. The condemned were covered in a tunic soaked in pitch and tar, then tied to posts in Nero's gardens and set on fire. They served as human torches to illuminate the night festivities. This form of execution was not only physically painful, but also psychologically devastating. The victims were transformed into objects, their humanity completely denied. The historian Tacitus, although hostile to Christians, described the scene with a certain horror, noting that even the Roman populace, accustomed to cruelty, felt a twinge of pity for the victims, as they were not being sacrificed for the public good, but to satisfy the personal cruelty of one man. This event marked a turning point, where the cruelty of the spectacles began to be perceived by some as excessive, even for Roman standards. 1. The fatal charade, the execution of Perpetua. The story of Perpetua and her companions in Carthage in 203 AD is one of the most detailed and disturbing accounts of Christian martyrdom in the arena. Perpetua, a young noblewoman, and her slave Felicitas were condemned to the beasts. But their execution was designed as a particularly sadistic spectacle. First, they were scourged. Then, they were brought into the arena naked and exposed to a wild cow, specifically chosen for its ferocity. The cow gored them and tossed them through the air to the delight of the crowd. Perpetua, even in her agony, is described as trying to cover her nakedness, a final gesture of dignity in the face of absolute humiliation. Wounded but still alive, they were taken out of the arena, only to be brought back later for the final blow. A novice gladiator was tasked with slitting their throats, but his hand trembled so much that Perpetua herself had to guide the blade to her own neck. This final act, a mixture of suicidal defiance and assisted execution, illustrates the psychological complexity of these events. It was not just about killing, but about breaking the human spirit in the most public and spectacular way possible. The spectacles of the Roman arena were more than just brutal entertainment. They were complex social rituals that reflected and reinforced the values of Roman society. The glorification of military power, the obsession with discipline and skill, the dehumanization of enemies and criminals, and the absolute power of the state over life and death. Analyzing these practices forces us to confront the darkest aspects of human nature and recognize that these were not events organized by marginal sadists, but by the Roman state itself, with the enthusiastic participation of respectable citizens. Senators, merchants, artisans, and even philosophers regularly attended these spectacles, applauding innovations in the art of cruelty. The gradual transformation of these events, from simple executions to elaborate stagings of death, demonstrates how the normalization of violence can lead to unimaginable extremes. Each generation of organizers tried to surpass the previous one in cruel inventiveness, creating an escalation of brutality that seemed to have no limits. The decline of these spectacles coincided with the Christianization of the empire, but not immediately. Even Christian emperors initially maintained some of these traditions, demonstrating how deeply rooted the culture of spectacular violence was in Roman society. The Roman arena became the ultimate symbol of how absolute power, combined with the desire to entertain the masses, can produce levels of cruelty that defy human comprehension. The blood-stained stones of the Colosseum remain as a silent testament to an era when death became the greatest show on earth.